to come up on the stage, please. First of all, sorry, with glasses, apologies. Kat Borlongan, who's the director of French Tech. Ian Rodgers, who's the chief digital officer of LVMH. And Brent Hobermann, who's co-founder and executive chairman of Founders Factory, which is a corporate-backed incubator and accelerator, but is also, of course, well known for all of his success stories, including, for instance, lastminute.com. Thank you so much. Just first of all, to kick off the session, in answer to that question, the answer from each of you, Kat, first, because you're at the very heart of France's efforts.
Hell yes. I don't know. Is that an appropriate response?
No, it sounded perfect.
I think that is a very appropriate response for a government official. I mean, look, we just completely leapfrogged the usual economic development curve of a startup ecosystem. We literally went from 4 years ago and having startups unable to find sufficient venture capital for like Series B rounds to seeing what we're seeing today, which is like mega round after mega round happening almost on a weekly basis, especially starting May. We didn't have a lot of unicorns for sure, and I remember last year France was feeling very bad about that because we're, sort of have a somewhat of a sort of like very nationalist movement around tech, and then all of a sudden, within what is it? We're in today is the 17th of September, right? We're halfway throughout the year, not really, and we've already seen 4 new unicorns pop up. So definitely a lot of things are happening. There's very special things that are happening right now in France, and I feel like we're just getting warmed up.
And for anyone who might have any doubt or not know the sector as well as you do, those figures are startling.
Well, they're startling, especially in terms of their development, right? Like if you compare us to the U.S. and we're very lucid about that, it's still a small fleck. Compared to the sort of development that you're seeing there, compared to the sort of size of the companies that you're seeing there. But the thing that you're seeing in France is one, there's a very sharp curve going upwards. Last year, we raised 3.6 billion total. So if you put all of the startups together combined, right, that was roughly 3.6 billion. That was almost double the year before that. This year, it's looking like we're already at something like 2.6 billion, and so it looks like this year we're going to go towards 5 billion. And yesterday, I don't know how many people have been following the news, but yesterday, the president just announced that a new 5 billion was going to be injected into the French tech ecosystem over the next 3 years.
It's huge. Brent, I'd like you to put that in some sort of comparison with what London went through when it actively tried to do the same thing just a few years ago. Are those figures as impressive as they sound? And are the efforts what they should be?
Great. Well, I think I'm going to start by being controversial, firstly saying, despite Brexit, I'm going to talk as a European and say that I think Europe needs to play to its competitive advantages in tech. And obviously we have, and your president spoke yesterday eloquently about the challenges from China and America. Maybe a little bit too much protectionism, but we could debate that in that speech, or talk of protectionism. But it is, where I think of it is obviously we're not in a zero-sum game, so that I do want London to succeed. London, yes, has done some amazing things, and we can talk more about that. But there is a danger when you talk about the arms race to attract entrepreneurs across Europe that we talk as if it's a zero-sum game. We want every European city to flourish, and that will help. What will help really, where the gap the way I thought your president didn't speak about enough yesterday, forgive me, was about making companies pan-European. It's so blatantly obvious that where we lack, actually, I think it's less about the funding, because the market works when there are enough successes, the SoftBanks of this world will come along and give you $1 billion. But they have to believe that you can scale very quickly. Now, I don't need to bore you all about the scale advantages of China and America, but what I can say is we don't yet have the European single digital market. Could we not put more of that 5 billion into making a European single digital market? I think nothing would make, debate question, nothing would make more of a bigger difference to more unicorns than doing that.
Kat, I'd like to put that to you afterwards, but first of all, Ian, you've been in France now for 4 years. You came straight from all of those years and those dynamic years in California, did you find what you'd expected to find? Did you find what you'd hoped to find once you got here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I really agree with what both Kat and Brent have said, and particularly about really needing to make Europe the solution and not just France. But let me put a little bit of a personal cultural overlay over the notion of moving from California to Paris, which is what I did 4 years ago. When people talk about the U.S. and the U.S. startup community, they're really talking about California, and in fact, they're actually talking about Northern California, to be really specific. They're not talking about Alabama or Arkansas or even Detroit, right? So you're talking about a very specific place and asking the question: is Paris a greener field? And I would say, as a combination of a place to live and work, yes. There are a lot of reasons to leave Silicon Valley at the moment, and we don't have time to go into all of them. But for me personally, that's the reason that in 1995, I moved to Los Angeles. I didn't move to Silicon Valley, and I ended up, for 15 of those 20 plus years that I lived in California, I commuted on a nearly weekly basis between LA and San Francisco, because for me, LA was the greener field. It had a nascent tech community, but we, not me, but we, many of us, between 1995 and 2015 when I left, we built something there, something I think to be proud of. We had some great companies, we had some good exits, and we really built something. And I would say what you really can feel in Paris at the moment, and you were right to ask the question in terms of thinking about Shoreditch a number of years ago, or New York at the time that Kickstarter and Etsy were founded, you have these moments where you feel the energy coming in, and you definitely feel that energy right now in Paris. And I think what we're all trying to do, and I've become a bit nationalistic after living here. I want France to win, and I want Europe to win, and to not be owned by Google, Facebook, or Alibaba, right? I think it's in all of our interest if we have a real competitive market. We all need to work to make sure that we build something here that will be left standing when this wave passes. So
to see what's left beyond. Kat, I'd like to put you that question of scale, because listening, of course, to Ian, it's true, California had that spark, but it also had that scale. Should France not be doing more to address this on a European scale? Wouldn't that be better?
I mean, I'd actually like to build on what Ian just said, and you're talking about wanting to vend a certain model, right? And I mean, it's true that earlier what I was talking about were numbers, but numbers are really the things that help us paint a portrait of what's going on. What we're really seeing is an influx, not necessarily of capital. I mean, there is the capital, but especially people. So I had the breakfast this morning, onboarding all of the next 40 with the ministers, and something that really surprised me, I realized that not all of them spoke French. Not all of them spoke French. And we were really stunned that, we had like next 40 top French companies based here, and we're like, oh no, we didn't think at all that we would have to have live translation or have papers, but that's something that's fundamentally changing. What we're seeing is not so much just the numbers and things like that, but people want France to win, not necessarily because of, not just nationalism. It's mostly because I feel like the center of gravity, you're talking about scale in California, the center of gravity of the Silicon Valley model of moving fast and breaking things, and what's happening right now in the US, right? People just aren't connecting to that anymore. And you're seeing a lot of people coming here to build the kind of companies they think are more aligned with their values. And so when we talk about Europe, we're not just talking about geography. What we're also talking about is just a completely different standard and different way of going about what we think companies are and what role they should have in society.
Are people, Brent, finding the right workforce in France when they come here?
Yeah, no, I think that's clearly one of the challenges. It's obviously changing, which is great. But one of the cliche international people talk about Paris is, sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but it's so wonderful, but without the French.
That's very controversial.
But I won't be that controversial today. It was ever anything I would have ever said or thought. But what I will say is, but what I will say is that one of the amazing things about London as an example is that when you look at startups, the data says that 50% of people who work in startups are from abroad, are international. In Paris, that number, I'm told, is 20%. So obviously it is changing, but anything we can all do to make it change, that's Europe's competitive advantage, is that diversity. And we just need to keep that acceleration going. Now, I know you've done the visa stuff, so I of course, and we did the visa stuff in tech visas in London about 5 years ago. So there is an arms race for how easy it is to come to countries, yes, but there is equally a lag of things like international schools and stuff like that.
And Ian, how have you found it then, putting together the kind of team that you needed once you get here to do what you wanted to do?
You know, the interesting thing for me is, I mean, we have found incredible people. I think that they generally are snowflakes, though. You know, we're not finding, you know, pools of them and then you just pick one. You know, you're finding people that are very specific and have
very
this,
well trained.
this
I mean, there's
combination
a great deal
skills.
of talent out there in terms of education and skills.
Absolutely, but I think it's the same anywhere. You know, you're always looking for somebody unique when you're doing something unique. But there is, you know, an incredible talent pool here, and you know, the relative, you know, both price and I would say attitude as well is fantastic compared to the U.S. and I would actually say specifically compared to Silicon Valley, where, you know, it's very tough to attract and retain people, you know, and expensive and
to hire and fire them in France, is that still a problem?
As far as I can tell, yes. We were talking about this, you know, before coming on, but I think that unfortunately that to me is one of the biggest barriers that I see. Is you need to be able to hire and fire easily. You know, when I tell people in France, you know, the quote from the Netflix culture document that says, average performance is rewarded with a generous severance package, they're like, wait, this can't quite make sense of it. They're like, I thought average performance was good. They're like, no. You know, they're really that part I think is very real, and there's a lot of culture that needs to be adjusted.
And
there.
what can be done about that?
Well, can I say one negative or positive side effect of that was a stat I read that was really interesting, is that because the severance payments packages are so generous in France, so many people get them, and then they can afford to start businesses because they can live for that time. You can look at that either as good or bad. But definitely when we did Made.com initially, we ran it with a French team, but all out of London for many years. We had 0, I think, French employees because of this employment law issue. We do now have a team here, but it's smaller than it would be if the employment laws were more flexible, for sure.
So things have gotten better, but not as far as they need to.
Definitely not. So, I mean, it's a very tough... We've seen the French protest on the streets for things like this.
What can be done about that?
I mean, we've seen the French protesters on the streets, but we've also seen Google, Samsung, Microsoft, IBM, everyone open their AI centers
because they
here.
can afford to.
Because they can afford to.
No, but this is my point. The laws, whether it's the PanEuropean or the labor laws, they make it so that only the companies with, you know, who can afford to conquer Europe.
That must be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, like to your point, I understand, and I think the PACT law has already, you know, progressively started improving that and adding that kind of flexibility and making things, you know, a lot more flexible than they were before. The point is that I think it's like tax, right? Like you can say that there are tax havens and on all of these places, and that's why we'd rather go to, you know, whatever, Luxembourg and things like that. But France will always have a threshold that is aligned with the values of the country, right? So I think it's a matter of sort of finding that middle ground, and I feel like France is really moving in that direction. But, you know, when we speak of talent, it's a pretty tricky talent market, right? I don't think you can completely compare us to the US and to the UK, because the French tech ecosystem is just so much younger. So the kind of seasoned talent that you get because you've had, you know, generations of successful exits just isn't the same. However, what you do have is an incredibly educated population with a country that has been systematically investing in STEM for the last few years. So I think like we're kind of going through that transitional phase where you have like one of the highest numbers of developers per capita, like, you know, in the world, according to GitHub and things like that. But at the same time, we're not doing so great when it comes to product managers. We're not doing so great when it comes to executives. And so, you know, speaking about you know, Europe, I think that's why it's also really important not just to have like pan-European businesses, but also pan-European teams that are you know, that are capable of really leveraging these kind of strengths from across the continent.
'cause I mean, one of the other, talking about competitive advantages of Europe, and one that we are trying to play to, because like Ian, we're here, so let's play with the best of what we've got. And one of those things is, again, it is actually the large corporates. So it's companies like LVMH, and that's why we've set up Founders Factory to play to Europe's strength. So Founders Factory, for those that don't know, super quickly, is a multi-sector corporate-backed incubator and accelerator. It's backed by some of the world's best companies: L'Oreal, Aviva, The Guardian, EasyJet, Marks and Spencer's, etc. And we are launching in Paris. We've announced it. We have got already Aviva committed, and we're expecting to get some more of the world's best companies committed. But what's interesting is, can we prove our thesis that great startups and great entrepreneurs can be the successful R&D of large corporates and then scale to be the unicorns, some of these 25 unicorns that your president wants by 2025? See, I've been listening.
Making notes. What's your view on this, Ian, the relationship?
Between the corporates and the startups, well, on our side, we have relationships with hundreds of startups per year, and we've built multiple programs to try to assist them, because we believe that a healthy startup ecosystem is a sign of a healthy industry, which is the opposite of what the music business, which I was in for 20 years, believed. They believed that startups were just straight up threat and let's kill them. So I tried to learn something positive from that and realize, okay, wait, the rising tide does lift all boats in this case, and so we want to support them because they become part of the engine of growth for the entire industry. But it's also good for us because we have a traditional business where the incumbents in the space, we have a transformation to go through, and we need some of what they have as well in terms of inspiration, capabilities, ways of working, et cetera. So we look at it slightly differently in that, are the investment arms of LVMH are the ones who actually invest as financial investors in startups, and that's fine. But from the corporate perspective, really trying to work with startups, either commercially or on just a relationship basis, to support and to help them and to help ourselves.
So to sort of build on that, so France, when it comes to corporates, is also quite different in the sense that we don't really have mid-market, right? Either you're working with lots of PMEs, or you're going straight for the SBF 120, essentially, if you're a B2B business here. And it turns out that roughly 70% of, let's say, the 100 of France's fastest growing companies are in fact B2B. In the next 40, it's slightly higher. It's closer to 80%. And most of those people, if they do stay in France and you are able to do efficient business with corporates, there's a very strong incentive to sort of stay here and expand here versus what people would normally do, which is go straight to the West Coast or go straight to Germany or go straight to, well, UK apparently. France UK B2B expansion has a very funny history, but and so something that we were really worried about some time ago is that, was it a couple years back, something like, we did a report for French Tech actually in my previous job, and it turned out that only 0.1% of total purchasing, and this is based on data that the corporates themselves volunteered, actually went to startups. And that was around the time that there was still massive, like everybody was massively obsessed with POCs, like with prototypes, and everybody was massively obsessed with having a spot at Viva Tech and looking as shiny as possible. I can see that's already starting to change. It's starting to change also by having people like Ian on board, of course, but I feel like we're all sort of moving in the right direction, and so I think that when it comes to corporates, the question is, once it can get unlocked, once you do see that kind of transformation, it won't be great just for the corporates themselves, but for the entire ecosystem. And I think we're headed in the right direction. I'm feeling pretty confident that in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to see just more business being done with startups, like higher volumes of transaction, and we're also going to start seeing more exits.
I think that's true. I think it's a great point that we've all heard nobody got fired for buying IBM, and today you could say that about Microsoft or Salesforce or a number of other companies from California which are not startups. And part of that's exposure, but also part of it's about the way that the big corporates are set up. When you have an IT team who is reporting to finance, their job is to reduce cost and reduce risk, and that pushes you towards towards a certain type of company. Whereas I think when you're going through this digital transformation and you come out the other side, you're much more open to to trying something new and working directly with startups in a real way.
And I mean, I will add to that, but I can't give more color on it. But there is an anecdote that actually we're pretty sure somebody actually got fired from a big corporate for not signing up to Founders Factory.
Get your pitch in there. I'd like to, before moving on to some of the success stories so far that we could mention, just on the broader business environment, how much of we've talked about the problem with hiring and firing. France's reputation in terms of people who come here, make money, taxes, for instance, how much of a barrier or not is that, do you think, in this wider push to get techs to be created here?
So this is new France. I think that's something that we kind of have to keep in mind, because sometimes when people think of France, they're still thinking of what France was 5 years ago. And quite a lot of things have changed. One of the main things that have changed when it comes to taxation is now we have a flat tax of 30% on capital gains. For that matter, everything is much more understandable compared to a time where we also abolished the wealth tax, for example, which has helped quite a bit. There's also so we have. I've been speaking to like managing directors of foreign, mostly American tech companies that are setting up shop here. They've been showing me their entire benchmark, comparing France to lots of different countries. And something that I didn't even realize we had was a gold standard for impatriate tax. And now when I thought about impatriates, I thought about French people coming back. What I didn't realize is that our gold standard for impatriate package is applicable to all European citizens. So there are actually quite a few things like that that make it very interesting to move back here.
And you also have, nobody's talked about it, but so forgive me, I might be wrong, but I thought you also have something fantastic, which is that if you sell your company, you can then reinvest in startups tax-free for 2 years.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So and that's been quite impactful, as I understand it.
Well, I mean, it's been quite impactful. I mean, I don't my husband has actually been going through something like that as well, so it's been very interesting to see from the inside how it functions. And so far, it's been pretty smooth, much smoother than I imagined that would be for someone who's just exited.
What is, to the two of you, what more does the French president need to do to make this the right kind of environment for that, the obvious answer to that question to be yes?
I think that there are still many practical things. I think progress has been made on employment. More should be done. Progress is made on taxation. We need to make sure that it's easy to stop a company. You need to be sure that entrepreneurs aren't sitting with any personal liability at the end of having to stop a company. And these kinds of basic things that we'll continue to talk to the administration about. But I actually think that the issue that is most important and probably the most difficult to tackle is what Brent brought up in the beginning, which is making Europe a market. Right? Because I think there's just this practical issue of, if I'm an entrepreneur and I start a company here, to get scale, I need to go somewhere else, right? And that is, and I think that unfortunately, and this, I had an experience in a previous startup that I had done where we tried to crack Europe. We spent, a sizable chunk of the money that we had raised with, American venture capital, trying to crack Europe, and eventually we went home with our tail between our legs because we couldn't do it. Europe isn't a market. What we had to do to build an e-commerce play in each market, we just couldn't do as a startup. And what that does, it leaves the door wide open for the Amazons and Googles and Facebooks, et cetera, because they can just pound away at it and lose money and kill all the startups for as long as they want. And the startups can't do it. So I think, sure, you could have the kind of startup that doesn't need that scale. All right, well, that's one approach. Or we could make a market out of Europe and do it for real.
Which should have been the plan to begin with, I guess. But Brent,
Yeah.
that's long term. What we're talking about.
I think short term. So short term, I think what that is, I would take at least 1 billion from the 5 billion announced yesterday, put that 1 billion into a matching fund that would match my international expansion costs out of France, and say, this is going to your translation, to your regulatory issues, your hiring issues, your HR issues, your transportation costs, et cetera, and set up $1 billion matching fund for startups that want to expand before they get copied. Because what we're not explicit about is one of the biggest issues is Europe has lots of fantastic tech companies that are national champions. And then by the time they get to national champions, everybody's heard of them. There's copies in 3 different markets. The best American guy then comes in and buys each 3, and all 3 in his countries. And that creates the decacorns and the super value.
I love, by the way, that it is the Brit on stage who's arguing for greater federalism.
Well, and
Kat,
if you
your
saw the
response.
cover of The Economist this week, is basically that this, this unity is moving the wrong direction, right? So, very timely.
I mean, I don't really think I can give my boss a to-do list, but
I will.
I'm like, how feasible would that sort of more pan-European approach be?
I think it's already in our DNA. I mean, like, if there's anyone who champions Europe right now, if there's any, like, modern leader right now that's championing Europe, it's definitely ours. It's definitely Macron, right? Like, there's no question about that. But maybe to your point in terms of, I'm going to give myself something to do, because anything that you bring up will has to get done by the operational teams. I would say our biggest priority right now should be attracting and developing the best possible talent pool there is. I mean, for multiple reasons, right? One, like, the geopolitics of today just make it easier, right? There's basically an open window, Sorry, no offense to the UK right now, but you're right. You have almost over 50. I think the number that I saw is 54% of the workforce in the UK is immigrants, and right now they're not feeling as welcome, right? Whereas in France, we're like, come here, right? Please come here, work for our startups. We'll give you a visa. You'll be here in 2 weeks. You can get them for your families. You don't have to pay for anything. It'll be really quick, and then you get a 4-year renewable permit, and things like that. So definitely we want to go strong with that, because even that visa, not that many people know that exists, and not many startups have been using it. Two, it's insane for me to see that with startups growing so quickly. So just so you know, the average net job creation rate of the next 40 is 30%, right? So with 30% and creating that many jobs, and yet feeling that there's a bottleneck when it comes to hiring, that's pretty difficult, pretty difficult experience. So definitely those are some of the things that we'll be working on moving forward. Bruno Le Maire, the Ministry of Economy and Finance, has asked his administrations and the General Directorate for Enterprises to work on something called the Pacte Productif. So basically, over the next few months, what you're going to see is different segments of that ministry rolling out their talent strategies for the next few years, really.
So trying to tap into that pool, which is, of course, crucial for all that you do. I'd like just to consider for you some of the great success stories that have come out of these efforts here in France. Brent, when you look at what France has done in this respect over the last few years.
In particular startups, I'd love to, obviously just in the next 40 this morning, I think, and I was the first investor in Allen.eu, so we do love French. I was just meeting with Nabla, which is I think going to be another great success story over time. We are big investors in Typology, which came from Ning Li, who was the co-founder of Made.com. So we're huge, and we want to do a lot more, and we do see definitely the technical talent coming out of France is really exciting. So we want to back that talent, and we want to make them global.
Are you seeing that, Ian, compared to what you saw in California in the 90s? Do you see those kinds of things beginning here?
Definitely, and I think the other thing on the talent front that you have here is many of the people that we have hired are French who are educated here, and they have that talent. They've gone somewhere else. I mean, I've brought people back to Paris from Singapore, from China, from New York, from California. I mean, these French people, but who have experience in each of these places are on my team, and I think that's a great thing to be taking advantage of right now.
Kat, to the last word to you, the next step then, what should we expect?
I mean, for talent, well, I invite everyone to please stay for Cedric O, who's going to be here a little later. He's our Minister of State, and he'll be talking about the next 40, which is an achievement in of itself, not just because we ranked 40 companies, but because there were 40 companies of this caliber to begin with, which is not necessarily the case a year ago. It's definitely not the case 2 years ago.
Amazing. Kat, Ian, Brent, thank you so much. Thank you.